Um, all right. Well, let's start. We are at 50 now, so we'll see. All right. So good morning, everybody, and as usual, I hope you're all well. So today, even though it appears that we still don't have a president officially anyway, and that this whole electoral process continues for a little while longer. How much longer is anybody's guess? Well, that shouldn't prevent us from looking at how the two candidates approach foreign policy or approached foreign policy for one of them. An analysis which is based primarily on Trump's administration record, obviously, over the past 4 years. And the precious little information offered publicly by the four candidates, president, vice president on each side, and their respective political platforms on global issues. Global issues, as you know, because I think we've already been through for those of you who've been through a presidential election with me already 4 years ago, you know that the global issues take a backseat, as they usually do during the American presidential campaign, to domestic concerns, like the fight, especially this year, against COVID-19, the revival of the economy, which is closely related to the pandemic, and the polarization of the nation. Well, deprived of information, one will have to speculate a little bit on, and I'm not a big fan of speculating, as you know, on what the future holds based on past actions and electoral promises that, as you very well know also, do not hold much value once the campaign is over. So first, the easier part, if you will, which is taking a quick look at President Trump administration's overall record. Trying to remember that his ascent to the White House in 2016 had stunned Washington's foreign policy establishment and unleashed frantic debates about the fate of the liberal international order, US hegemony, and the future of democracy. And nervous allies wondered at the time if Trump would abandon NATO, start a war with North Korea, or demolish the international trading system. So 4 years later, let's see how those early predictions and concerns were justified or not. Well, what we can say at first glance is that the alliances are still standing, if frayed. America's hard power remains unrivaled, for now anyway, and Trump steered clear of any costly new military blunders like the war in Iraq or the 2011 military intervention in Libya. Even some of Trump's fiercest critics acknowledge that the administration has achieved some important foreign policy successes, most notably on China and in the Middle East. Overall, however, the majority of foreign policy experts have come to the conclusion that there is actually no clear verdict on Trump's foreign policy. To many on the left, and even some conservatives, none of the administration's victories outweighs the damage that Trump has done to the office of the presidency or his response to the pandemic that killed more than 230,000 Americans so far. In contrast, many Trump supporters and conservative policy experts argue that setting aside the president's Twitter feed and a bitter partisan climate in Washington, his administration has done what mattered most, which is strengthen US hard power and better position the country for what lies ahead. Overall, Trump's foreign policy moves can be grouped into three broad categories, if you will. Big victories, the so-called technocratic victories, and misfires and missed opportunities. Categories that we're going to consider briefly and separately. Let's look at what I call big victories. For starters, there is China. The Trump administration has systematically turned the US national security apparatus away from decades of focus on the Middle East towards an era of renewed great power competition, rousing Washington to the view that Beijing represents the greatest existential threat to the United States in coming decades. The administration has pushed back against China, Chinese influence operations, and raised global awareness of the threat posed by China's fast developing technology, especially in next generation mobile communications. It has also taken steps to reduce US reliance on China for critical materials needed for economic and national security, redoubled support for Taiwan, including several pending arms sales, and taken a harder line on Beijing's land grab in South China Sea. And through the Indo-Pacific Group, the administration has coordinated regional policy with India, with Japan, and with Australia. At the same time, the US military has laid the groundwork for ambitious plans to considerably strengthen the US Navy to over 350 ships, or possibly even 500, a long-term plan that some defense hawks have cheered as an adequate response to China's growing military threat, particularly to its neighbors. To many experts, getting the United States on sounder footing to confront and compete with the Chinese Communist Party is the most significant achievement of this administration, even if it turns out to be Trump's only term. Then there is Israel. Trump's decision to move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem drew warnings of uprisings in the region and conflict with Palestinians, but neither came to pass. In the United States, the embassy move has enjoyed broad bipartisan backing and is now largely seen as irreversible. Democratic presidential nominee or president-elect or informally elected President Biden said he would keep the embassy in Jerusalem if elected, even as historic bipartisan support for Israel looks to be eroding in democratic circles. The Trump administration also claimed credit for normalizing relations between Israel and two of Washington's closest allies in the Middle East, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, as well as Sudan, Arab state in Africa. The move, which the White House heralded as the dawn of a new Middle East, was praised both by Democratic and Republican lawmakers as a rare spot of good news. And while some experts questioned whether Trump could really claim credit for diplomatic dealings that were long in the works, for instance, the Emirates and Israel had been cooperating on security matters behind the scenes for years. There is no question that Washington's active role in facilitating the so-called Abraham Accords, as the agreement is officially known, has been decisive, prompting some other Gulf states to follow suit, like Bahrain, or to consider seriously such an eventuality, like Oman for now. That such agreements could be reached without any Palestinian interference is even more remarkable, considering the previous firm position and rejection by the Arab capitals of a peace deal with Israel in the absence of a Palestinian-Israeli negotiated solution. And finally, there is the Islamic State, or ISIS. Under the Trump administration, Washington rolled back the terrorist group's physical caliphate. Let's not forget that at its peak in 2014, the Islamic State controlled over 41,000 square miles of territory between Iraq and Syria, roughly the size of Pennsylvania, and had more than 7 million people under its control. And the administration also, in October 2019, killed its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The defeat of the group was a significant military achievement for the Trump administration, with one big caveat, however. ISIS ideology still lives today, and ISIS has not stopped to stage attacks through proxies or by its own members in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, and in West Africa. Then there are what I would call the technocratic victories. Victories that have never made national news, being overshadowed by the more spectacular foreign policy moves, but victories that could have important impacts on US foreign policy in the future, as some of these changes could last through a drastically different democratic administration. Apart from Trump's repeated efforts to decimate the foreign aid budget, his administration, spurred on by Congress, carried out important reforms of US foreign aid machinery, overhauling the US Agency for International Development and bolstering America's ability to compete with China Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, countering China's neo-imperialistic projection of soft power. One of these initiatives was the creation of the International Development Finance Corporation. Formed in December of last year, the DFC, with its overall lending capacity of $60 billion, provides loans, loan guarantees, and insurance for development projects in lower income countries, mostly in Africa and the Indo-Pacific region, projects which are being undertaken by US businesses. Though it went unnoticed at the time due to the sudden departure of John Bolton, Trump's third national security advisor, last year, the president unveiled new counter-terrorist sanction powers for the federal government, considered by many experts as the most significant update to the US terrorist sanctions regime put in place in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. The new provisions allow government agencies, for the first time, to go directly after leaders of terrorist groups and target groups, financiers and accountants, as well as individuals who participate in training to commit acts of terrorism. And in retrospect, the only bright move by the administration in its response to COVID-19 was the decision to repatriate hundreds of thousands of Americans abroad who were trapped and scrambling for ways to get home when countries around the world began locking down their borders in the early days of the pandemic. After a rough start, the State Department undertook an unprecedented campaign of repatriation, and by June had coordinated the return of over 100,000 Americans abroad, which was a significant logistical feat. And while most of the credit goes to the rank and file in the diplomatic corps, this massive undertaking was hailed as an unappreciated achievement of the Trump administration. And finally, we are what I call the misfires and missed opportunities. Just a few examples. The impasse on North Korea, on North Korea denuclearization negotiations, a long-delayed Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that stumbled out of the gate, and unfulfilled promises to fully extricate US troops from costly wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And hanging over everything is the coronavirus pandemic, which, because of its global reach, can be considered as a foreign policy issue and a major US failure. Indeed, with 4% of the world's population, the US accounts so far for 20% of the total number of deaths related to COVID-19 in the world. And Washington has spurned an international campaign to coordinate developing a vaccine. According to a number of experts, the COVID crisis is the first international crisis since pre-World War II, where there has been zero US international leadership. In fact, for all the victories that Trump and his supporters can point to, some experts insist that the losses, missed opportunities, and collateral damages weighed much heavier in the balance, pointing out that not only the losses outweighed the gains, but the gains were possible without the losses. Well, these are assessments which are much too early to make, obviously, and should be left to historians in the future. Now, as I told you, looking at past records is the easier part. Trying to predict what will follow is much harder, particularly in foreign relations, where so much depends on outside actors and circumstances, and also how rarely these issues came up, as I mentioned earlier, during the presidential campaign. Let me give you an example. This spring, Joe Biden agreed with his former primary rival, Senator Bernie Sanders, to form a number of joint task forces on various issues, such as healthcare, criminal justice, climate change, the economy, education, and immigration. And none of these committees cover foreign policy issues as traditionally defined, leading many observers to believe that the area of foreign affairs, unlike the areas which I mentioned to you earlier, would not be influenced by the ideological orientations advocated by Sanders and Senator Warren, leading them to conclude that under a President Biden administration, domestic policy would move left, but foreign policy would not. In reality, this is not what would happen. As many elements of a Biden foreign policy would almost certainly move left as a dependent variable of domestic policy. During the presidential campaign, Biden used the formula of foreign policy for the middle class to express the idea that trade and international economic policy must be guided by the benefits that they bring to average Americans rather than to American multinationals. Yet the very different currents and of opinion within the Democratic Party mean that one can hardly expect a consensus to form around the question of what foreign policy best advances the interests of average Americans. Biden is a foreign policy traditionalist to whom the language of geoeconomics is alien, and the same is true of almost all the people around him. And the progressives in the Democratic Party hope to move them to the left. Mm. In the meantime, every word that Biden has uttered during the campaign has been carefully dissected and analyzed around the world. For instance, in his speech at the Democratic Convention, Biden described 4 priorities for his administration, including tackling COVID-19 and promoting racial justice. But not China, for instance, relations with China did not make the list. Needless to say that this type of omission got noticed in places like Tokyo, Taipei, and New Delhi, where Trump's policies, albeit poorly implemented, were considered fundamentally correct compared to a well-implemented but ambiguous regional strategy under the previous Obama-Biden administration. However, those same Asian allies seemed relieved a couple of months later when Biden called President Xi Jinping of China a thug in one Democratic presidential debate, and China an authoritarian dictatorship in another. In fact, from all the interviews and discussions involving Biden, he gives the impression that, like many American political leaders, he gave up on the idea that China can be reformed, arguing instead that the United States must outcompete its Asian rival. His campaign has also sent some signals to Asian allies directly, reaching out to the members of the Associations of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and hinting that Biden would make a point of attending the regional meetings that Trump so often skipped. ASEAN is essential to tackling major challenges like climate change and global health. Anthony Blinken, one of Biden's senior advisors, recently wrote, President Biden will show up and engage ASEAN on critical issues. Another area of active involvement that can be expected by the Biden administration is Central and South America. As the Obama administration top troubleshooter for the region, Biden is very familiar with the area, having built relationships with Central American leaders and helping convince Congress to pass in 2015 a $750 million aid package to the region. Drawing on the experience acquired over the 8 years as vice president, Biden and his team of foreign policy advisors have created plans for the region that are in a way a repudiation of President Trump's approach, which consisted of basically pushing back the flow of immigrants and drugs through harsh enforcement means and threats of imposing economic sanctions on neighbors. Instead, Biden and his team of experts, that includes immigrants from Central America, say they would focus on the issues of poverty and violence, which are the root causes of migration and instability. By pushing back against corruption and investing in jobs creation and improved governance. And in a region where the former vice president feels that the United States has long been regarded as a bully dictating policy to to smaller countries, as he wrote in his book, a Biden White House would likely use the power of persuasion rather than the fear of imposition. In South America now, a Biden administration would once again retire the Monroe Doctrine, which is, as you probably know, a 19th century policy under which Washington basically considers the Americas its exclusive sphere of influence, within which any attempt by overseas powers to intervene is seen as a hostile act. The Trump administration resurrected the doctrine in 2018 to push back on China's diplomatic and trade inroads in Latin America. And at the time, the administration launched its Growth in the Americas initiative, intended to spur investment from the US. Unfortunately, that program got little traction today and includes no new streams of financing, mainly because the region was viewed by the Trump administration as a source of unwanted migrants to the United States. Now, moving to Europe, the Western Europeans, by and large, Western European leaders, will certainly welcome with open arms Biden administration's less confrontational attitude about trade, and at the summit meetings of the Group of Seven and NATO, as well as Biden's commitment to multilateralism after 4 years of constant criticism from the current administration. And the probable return of the Biden administration to the Paris Climate Accord and to the World Health Organization would cement this reconciliation. That being said, however, there are very few chances for a return to the type of close ties that characterized the US-Europe alliance during the Cold War and immediately afterwards, as a number of issues such as energy, climate change, NATO, the Middle East, the relations with China, just to mention a few, that have arisen even before Trump's presidency, will not fade away with a new administration in Washington. Why is that? I think there are two reasons for that. The first, because beyond the current administration confrontational attitude and transactional relationship with Europe, which can be fixed, as I mentioned earlier, the Europeans themselves have gradually come to the realization that their national interests sharply diverge from those of the United States in many areas, such as energy, trade, human rights, relation with China and Russia, just to name a few, the major ones. That has prompted many Western European political leaders, led by President Macron of France and Chancellor Merkel in Germany, to seriously consider a total reconfiguration of their relation with the United States, what they called a strategic autonomy, which would make a Europe which is less dependent on the United States and more assertive politically and economically. And even if this idea seems at this time more aspirational than real, it has been gaining traction. Already, the Europeans seem increasingly reluctant to take sides in the current China-US rivalry and increasingly opposed to some US initiatives, such as Washington's unilateral withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear deal, from the WHO and the Paris Climate Accord. Again, such of these disagreements are temporary and, as I said, can be resolved. Some others, however, run deep. Take the Iranian deal, for example. Deal that, even though was signed under the Obama-Biden administration, could not be joined again by a Biden administration in its current state anyway. Why is that? First, because 5 years went by since its signature, and the US has withdrawn from it. And with only 10 years to expiration, an extension would have to be renegotiated on different terms, especially the sunset clause, the clause that would allow, again, the Iranian government to build a nuclear bomb, which, if you remember, would be allowed to do based on this deal in 2030. So it's 10 years from now. And second, because contrary to Obama administration hopes, the Iranian leadership has not warmed up to the United States in the interim period since 1914, 1915, nor has it stopped to finance and help militarily its proxies in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and Lebanon, which doesn't seem to bother much the Europeans, but it does bother the United States. And finally, because Iran would most likely refuse to renegotiate any deal with the United States on the grounds that Washington is not a trustworthy partner, having unilaterally withdrawn from an international deal that it has signed and approved. Now, the second main reason is the decision made by successive administrations in the United States to gradually turn inwards and leave to others the management of global challenges that have grown more complex and more urgent over the years, from climate change to mass migration to technological disruptions and infectious diseases, precisely at the time when authoritarianism, nationalism, and illiberalism have been gaining ground worldwide. This loss of global influence of the United States over the past few years has also been a contributing factor to the loss of trust in democratic institutions. And as a result, the international system that the US so carefully constructed after World War II is coming apart at the seams. So, in a few words, this is a global context in which the next US president will have to address the world, trying, on the one hand, to rebuild confidence in his leadership while mobilizing the country, the United States and its allies, to rapidly meet new challenges. It's a very tall order, as I said earlier, for either one of the candidates. So this is basically where we stand today on November 9th. We'll have a little more to say, more into details when the white smoke will come out of the White House, like at the Vatican, and the announcement will be made, habemus papam, we'll see what happened. But I don't think we have two more get-togethers next Monday, the following one. We'll see what happens, and with a little bit of luck, we might be able to develop some of these issues, as long as we know who will be in charge, really. In the meantime, I open the floor. Obviously, I have a few questions here already, so let's get started. The first couple have to do with the computer itself. It does not. Then Sherry, the first question. I'm not understanding your statements about Trump creating new procedures to sanction bad actors. The Magnitsky Act passed under Obama already does it. What is new about what Trump did? Well, the Magnitsky Act, I don't know if it went as far as Trump provisions on really going. It was started under Obama, but I think it was developed under Trump to go further in to give the U.S. agencies more latitude and more freedom to go after. It broadened the scope, if you will, of the sanctions measures, which were indeed started by the Obama-Biden administration. They are not new, you're right, but they have been broadened and developed by the Trump administration. Larry, what do you say about Trump not addressing any of Putin, Russia's activities in US elections, Afghanistan and Europe versus Biden? Well, this is an old story about Trump not addressing any of Putin's activities anywhere, including in the US elections. I don't understand, you mean Russia's activities in US election and then Afghanistan and Europe versus Biden? I would say two things about it. It's much easier for someone who's not in charge to make a stand of political statements about what he plans on doing. And it's the Trump administration would argue that they do not have to make the statements because they are acting as incumbents. So whatever you see Trump do in Afghanistan or in Europe, they don't have to put out statements. Now, about Russia, you're right. Probably Trump could address some of the American-Russian issues. But as you very well know, for the past 4 years, he stayed away from making statements on Putin in particular, unlike other leaders around the world. So that's not surprising. As for the Afghanistan, he promised to pull out all the troops before the end of the year, as I mentioned to you. He might still do that. He still has a month and a half, but there are still 6,000-7,000 American troops there. And number one, and number two, as you very well know, there are peace talks between the Kabul government there and in Geneva, between the Kabul government in Doha and Geneva, between the Kabul and the Taliban, which don't seem to have advanced too much. Now, do the Taliban wait for the Biden government to take over the White House and then react? Could very well be. But the talks have not progressed very much. So I don't think, and these are American broker diplomatic discussions, peace talks. So as long as there is no outcome on this talk, the United States will not have anything to say in particular. And I assume that at the demand, at the request of the Kabul government, the US is not going to pull out unilaterally its troops if Kabul is going to fall to the Taliban. So probably there is a wait and see period in Afghanistan with not much to announce. As for Europe, what would you expect Trump to say about Europe that he hasn't said already? You've seen also, Larry, speaking of Europe, you must have seen some of the reactions of the European leaders yesterday and the day before yesterday about Biden's most likely election. Some of them welcomed it, but the Eastern European countries have been spectacular in their silence, as was expected, actually. The Baltic states, for instance, as well as, and those are NATO states and EU states. The Baltic states and Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, all these states have not reacted yet to Biden's election. They are very cautious because they had excellent relations with Trump. Now, going to Asia, I don't know, you must have seen the Iranian reaction, which was basically to say that the American elections are a spectacle, and they showed the failure of the American so-called democratic system. So there is not much reaching out to the new administration in Tehran. India reacted, but basically they reacted mostly not so much to Biden's election, but they reacted to Harris's election, who is half Indian, as you very well know. So it was a question of pride for the Indian president to point that out. And then, surprisingly, the most enthusiastic leader has been Trudeau across the border, who had awful personal relations with Trump. But the most cautious one is very strangely was Mexico's president, Obrador, who put out a statement yesterday saying basically that he cannot comment on the outcome of the election, because the outcome is not, the results are not definite, and he will wait till very cautiously till there will be a president in the White House, which was surprising from the Mexican president. All right, from Laurie. Hi, Laurie. This month's Vanity Fair article they called Jared digs into Trump's newly created DFC that does bridge financing for developing countries. Yes. My take is Trump pulled this function from the transparent and regulated US aid and gave it to Jared's body to solicit Wall Street companies to fund projects when the developing countries' own banks won't take the lending risk. More risk on the backs of US taxpayer for projects that made shouldn't go forward. Well, Laurie, you can look at it this way also, but nonetheless, this is a very important initiative that the Trump administration has taken to help out developing countries. And
Pierre, my question to you, though, is based on your experience with functions shuffling around in government, why would it have been necessary to have pulled this from USAID, where it had been done for so many years?
Not very efficiently, though, Laurie. I don't think that has been done by USAID. Hasn't been an example of efficiency. Now, we're talking here about private investments, you're right, and in developing countries, which would, in a way, compete with the World Bank, not so much with the USAID, but with the World Bank. And in itself, it's a good initiative. It's positive. Now, to whom it will benefit, that's a very good question also. I just don't know. It has a huge capacity of investment at first glance. And there have been already some projects which this fund is working on. So let's see how this works out. Let's give it for once a benefit of the doubt.
It's not in my nature, Pierre. Sorry.
I can tell. I can tell, particularly when it comes to this administration, I guess.
Amen.
All right. Anything else?
Pierre?
Yes. Hi, Tom.
I think, how's it going today, sir?
All right.
I think the reason Eastern Europe is so high on Trump is because they are drifting towards fascism. They're drifting basically towards, in Hungary and such, towards the fascist forms of government.
Well,
and they see in Trump a fellow traveler. Because, number one, I mean, this is the closest the United States, in terms of what we're looking at, has had in terms of a fascist in power. And also because he hasn't taken the lead in terms of human rights violations around the globe at all over the last 4 years, which means that he's basically giving these countries a clean slate to do whatever they want.
I didn't say the contrary, Tom. You're absolutely right. That being said, they still would have, yes, they cheered for Trump. And but let's give Trump also the benefit of the doubt on one thing when it comes to his relations, this administration relation with Eastern Europe. Pompeo has been very active in Eastern Europe. He has gone to Eastern Europe and much more often than any of the previous secretaries of state, and committed the United States, at least on paper, to help the Eastern Europe, which they did. I mean, they sent arms, and as you very well know, they took some of the troops out of Germany to put them in Poland. So, and they deployed a defense missile system in Romania and in the Czech Republic. So they have done things to reassure the Eastern Europeans, against a possible intervention by Russia, which I must say the Obama administration had not done after Russia annexed Crimea and part of the eastern Ukraine. So I don't know how much the Trump administration would have done had Russia intervened militarily in one of these countries. But he gave the impression that he was more involved in the well-being and the security, in a way, of the Eastern European countries than the Obama administration. Now, that being said, indeed, you're right. Most of them are illiberal. I wouldn't say fascist. Fascist, it goes a little bit too far. But like Hungary or Poland are illiberal governments which were put in power by, it must be pointed out, by a majority of citizens. So it's not like they took over in a military coup. They were officially elected. So they are riding on this wave of nationalism and populism. I agree with you. But to say that they are fascist government, that's maybe going a little bit too far. But you're right. Some of the reasons lie in the fact that they see Trump as someone who does not get involved in human rights issues. And he never said a word about what's going on in Poland or in Hungary. On the contrary, in Hungary, when Soros's university got kicked out to Vienna, the US, in a way, said, well, basically every country is free to do whatever they want on the soil. So we are not going to intervene, even though Soros is an American citizen, and the US could have said something in the defense, not necessarily of Soros, but the so-called rights when Orban government pushed that university out of Hungary, which is next door, actually. As you know, they are in Vienna now.
Has Trump even mentioned Belarus and the people fighting for freedom there at all?
It seems to me there were a couple of statements, not by Trump himself, but by the administration. But not lukewarm, sort of, generic, but nothing spectacular, like meeting with the leader of the opposition movement who now lives in Lithuania. I know that Macron went to Lithuania when he visited Poland 2 weeks ago, and he met with this lady Tikhanovskaya, who's the leader of the opposition in Belarus, which gave her some, political weight. I don't know if anybody from the State Department, or I don't know, Pompeo visited Eastern Europe, some of the Baltic states not too long ago. I don't believe that he met with her. Robert, do you foresee a difference in the response to Hong Kong? Well, the Hong Kong issue, Robert, is part of the overall issue of the US relations with China. And again, as I mentioned in my presentation, this is probably one of the issues one of the very rare issues on which there is bipartisan support in the Congress to take a hard line on China. How that hard line is going to translate in the Biden administration, I don't know. But since the Biden administration seems definitely more interested in taking up issues like human rights, I believe that if nothing else, because of the human rights issue, Hong Kong will be in the center of the US preoccupation when it comes to China, in addition to all the other issues that, that will be brought up. That's the difference I see. It's the angle through which it would be approached. The Trump administration was looking at China mostly from a transactional point of view and only from the way it affected the United States economically and in terms of trade. The Biden administration, in contrast, would look at it also, obviously, the trade issue is very important, from a human rights point of view. And that's where Hong Kong probably will be placed. Ricky, I have just received some very concerning news from Denmark on the COVID. May I unmute and tell? By all means. I told you it's a new democracy starting.
Unmute. Here I am. Hi, everybody. Yeah, this is kind of scary. Let me just give you a real quick background. In Denmark, particularly the north of the peninsula, north of Germany, there is a lot of mink farms, 1,400 mink farms in Denmark. It happens that Denmark is the world's largest exporter of high quality mink to China and the Far East. And these mink farms, some are small, some are large. There are millions of minks in these farms. Suddenly, a couple of days ago, they discovered that there is a mutation going on in the COVID. It may have gone from humans to minks and from minks back to humans. And they call it COVID-19. It's a new mutation. It's entirely new. And they are very concerned about it affecting the new vaccine that's being developed all over the world. And it may cancel the effect of the vaccine if this new mutation is not being contained in Denmark. So now everybody's up in nervous about this. They have closed off entirely many counties, people staying home. They have killed all the mink in the total country. And they need to make sure they can contain this new mutation of COVID. And that's all I know. This is just happening the last couple of days. So I don't even know to which extent the World Health Organization is involved, but it's something we need to keep an eye on because it sounds pretty dangerous, I would think. Have you heard anything about this?
No, I have not. But probably Denmark brought that up with WHO already by now. Definitely, they must have contacted WHO, and they must be looking into it. But if it turns out to be true, and it's a mutation of the virus, that was a worst nightmare from the very beginning. Actually, some scientists considered that, and they warned the medical world and then the public that mutation of the virus might very well happen in the fall. That was back in the spring. And if turns out to be indeed the case, obviously, just when the announcement was made today on the vaccine and the 90% success of the first tests on people, that would be a very worrying development indeed.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the information. I'm going to see what the European press says about it. I haven't seen anything else.
I think the Times reported it this morning, that they found that it had mutated.
About Denmark?
About, yeah, that it had mutated from minks to humans and back to humans in a different form. The time, that's the Times
Believe
said.
it or not, I haven't seen the New York Times yet. So
And of course,
yeah, well, I'm not doubting it, but I haven't. I cannot comment on it.
and they're exterminating the minks. I guess you did read that.
I heard that 2 to 3 days ago as well, that they're going to have to exterminate the entire mink population, which is a massive economic blow to Denmark as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, at least you have fish.
Yeah. Well, you know, that area where they have all the mink farms, or most of them, is not good agricultural soil. So they figured this out, that the minks were very lucrative for them, and of course they could go out in the waters surrounding the area and catch fish for food. So that was working well for them. But now, when the mutation is jumping from animals to people and vice versa, we have a real serious problem.
And
what happens when the COVID crosses over to fish? We'll really be zapped.
Well, this is just trying to be funny, you know, but it's not fun.
No, I'm not 100% sure I'm laughing.
No.
if it ever actually crossed over the fish, I feel like, we're going to eat grass?
The Danes?
All the minks are killed now. There's no minks anymore. They're all killed and destroyed. Oh, the issue is that the mutation COVID has jumped to people, and we need to contain it still. So that's where we're at, and hopefully WHO can be helpful in doing that, so it doesn't spread that.
I have a question. You read that in the press?
Yeah, it comes from a girlfriend I have who is very, very serious about truth and understand what's going on. I really trust her. She's extremely.
No, that's not the point. I trust your sources, but I'm saying this friend of yours is in Denmark.
Yes.
Okay, so she reads the Danish.
Oh yes.
She
and, okay.
Now, my what's not clear to me is that this meat that Denmark exports, you said, in huge quantities to China, for instance.
Yes.
Did some of this meat come back from China to Denmark, or how that?
No, it's the mink furs. You know, just the furs. I don't know if they take the furs off in Denmark and just export the furs, or how they do it. I don't know that. But of course, it's the furs of the mink. The mink furs in Denmark are supposed to be highest quality. And they make mink coats and stuff of it in China, which is a status symbol.
Oh, now I understand. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so it's not the meat itself, it's the fur.
Not at all.
If the fur of the meat that it's exported.
Mink, because the mink is such a high quality from Denmark, I don't know why, but that's just the case. It's very lucrative, it's very expensive, and so it's sought after to make mink coats for people as.
Now I understand. Okay, yeah. Okay, so they export it to China, and then the Chinese made coats or whatever they make.
Yeah, whatever they do.
And they export them back to Europe or somewhere.
I don't know what they do. I don't know what they do with them. Yeah.
Oh, that's not.
Probably, yeah.
Now,
so keep an eye on it. Let's hope for the best. It needs to be contained. So that's what I'm saying.
Just stay with me for a second, because there is a message here from Michelle, who says from the AP, there are so far 12 known cases of humans having been infected by the new virus strain in Denmark.
Mm-hmm.
Cases of COVID-19 were found in over 200 out of more than 1,100 Danish mink farms, the government said on Wednesday. So that goes back a few days indeed. People who have contracted the new form of the virus don't appear to be suffering more severe symptoms, according to Danish health officials. The virus was most likely originally transmitted to the mink from humans and then back again. Okay, now, okay, I understand a little bit better what's the connection between the meat, yeah, the mink and the. All right, well, if this form of virus at least doesn't appear to be more severe than the one that we are known now, it's encouraging in a way. What is not encouraging is that if the new vaccine will not take care of the virus as it is supposed to be taken care of, if there is a mutation indeed. Yes. Well, thank you for letting us know. I have a question from Alan. Maybe calling it fascism goes too far. He refers to the Eastern European countries, I think. And Tom's comment, but autocracy or leaning towards autocracy is more accurate. US policy post-World War II to promote democracy as the best way to promote peace and stability seems to have been abandoned by Trump in terms of his relationships with Putin, Erdogan, etc. Can you comment? Alan, I don't have much to say. Yes, you're right. I wouldn't call it fascism either, but we have a disagreement with Tom on terms, but basically they are illiberal nationalistic governments. So in that respect, he's right. Now, US policy indeed has been to promote democracy, and that has been, in a way, the founding of the international global US-led order after World War II. Now, the promotion of democracy have been abandoned by Trump in terms of his relationship with Putin, Erdogan, etc. I don't know if it had been totally abandoned by Trump. What is true, and we've said that many times over the past few years, is that Reike, you're putting your hand on the screen. Okay. Is that Trump's policy has been transactional. He didn't pay much attention to human rights. He conducted diplomacy in terms of America first, what was good for the United States in terms of policy or economy. So yes, but that's only comment I like to make. There is not much to say in addition to, well, that's well known. I mean, you know that just as well. Yes, he focused on different things which to him seem more important, like the U.S. economy and what the U.S. can get out of a trade deal, rather than just say anything about human rights in different countries where U.S. has had interest. But to be fair also to Trump, you know, that has been going on in the United States and the superpower for not only, it hasn't started with Trump. It's been exacerbated by the Trump administration, but it's not something new. The US had allies and looked the other way many, many times when it wasn't convenient for the US to intervene and to point out that the human rights were not exactly implemented or respected in some countries. Why? Because US has interest, financial or economic interest in those countries. So they did not pay much attention to what was going on there. It was always before, indeed, at least as regard to China, the previous administrations had always made public statements about the lack of human rights in that country. And Trump did give that up. And also in the first term of the Obama administration, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, the human rights were mentioned once or twice by the Obama administration. But that was mostly dropped during the second term of Obama, and there wasn't much case made out of the human rights. I can give you an example, again, how the human rights work differently according to whom you're asking. I mentioned that before in 2011, 14, when was it? When you had the Ukrainian revolution, a number of American politicians were in Kiev demonstrating next to the people in the Ukraine for human rights and the new pro-Western government. And at the time, Putin and the Kremlin accused the United States of getting involved or interfering in other countries' domestic affairs. I think Senator McCain, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the American politicians leading a group of American lawmakers to Ukraine to make their point. So human rights, indeed, it depends how you look at it and whom you ask. When it's convenient for the superpowers anyway, they would lean on different countries to comply with human rights. And when you deal with allies who violate human rights, you look the other way. So, anything else?
Pierre.
Yes.
I think, unlike probably any administration I've ever seen, you have to make a differentiation. You were talking about the accomplishments of this administration. You have to make a differentiation between the accomplishments of this administration and Trump. Because in a lot of cases, I don't think that they're accomplishing things because of Trump. I think they're accomplishing things, besides Trump, going around Trump.
In spite of Trump.
Yes, because in many cases, the people who have worked for him, who are in a far better position than you or I to comment on him, people like Kelly and McMaster and Mattis,
I agree with
Bolton,
you. I agree with you, Tom.
he has no idea of what's going on in his own administration. Sherry pointed out the Magnitsky Act. I could say with reasonable certainty, if you walked up to Trump and asked him about the Magnitsky Act, he'd probably look at you cross-eyed and say, "What?" I mean, they basically are in a position, like, for instance, we did manage to pass sanctions on Russia, but we did that because Trump was actually trying to veto the sanctions, and it was too much of an embarrassment to him to actually veto them. In many cases, they actually had to go around him. So it's the accomplishments of the administration as opposed to what Trump is actually bringing to the table.
You might be right, but that being said, Tom, in all fairness, I wasn't there, okay? So I don't know exactly. I know that a lot of people who were appointed by Trump tried to, not to run their own foreign policy, but tried to moderate Trump in a certain way, at least to calm his worst instincts and to make him more presidential, if you will, in the decision he was taking. That being said, I cannot get into that honestly because I don't know. I wasn't there. And then whatever was achieved, the achievements by the administration, I have to say is the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot say Kelly did that and Pompeo did that and McMahon did that, but against Trump's better judgment, it's difficult. I can only go by the book, if you will, and point out what Trump's administration has done. I don't know how much Biden will get involved in foreign policy either. We don't have an administration yet. We don't know who the Secretary of State will be. And we don't know who the civil servants who are going to work and the foreign policy experts will be. So indeed, a policy is never run only by the president. It's run by a group of people surrounding him. Particularly in this case, I believe the exception to the rule must be the Middle East, which was run, so to speak, in the family. Okay, he gave the Middle East dossier, so to speak, to Kushner, and to his special envoy to the Middle East and to his ambassador in Jerusalem. But aside from who had been his lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, previously. So aside from the Middle East, really, it's very difficult to me to assess how much of the foreign policy was run by Trump. Probably not much, and how much of it is attributable to to how much credit other people can take for it. Probably a lot, but it's difficult. I know what you're saying, and I agree with you but that is true in most administrations.
But his ignorance is really monumental, though, and what the people who have worked under him in positions like Secretary of State and such have said is that he has no interest or curiosity in even knowing what's going on. He doesn't show up for his own intelligence briefings. That's known. He will not show up at his own intelligence briefings.
That is true for the domestic issues also, not only for the foreign policy issues. That was true in general. Probably in foreign policy, even more so. He has no interest in whatsoever, except where his towers are, in the world. Those he knew because he traveled to those places, and he had contacts with the leaders of those countries. For instance, Erdogan. That's how he knew Erdogan, from his previous visits to Turkey, where I think
his business dealings there.
He has business dealings in Turkey, yes. So certain countries he knows. Well, he knows. He doesn't know certain countries, but he knows the leaders of certain countries, having met them previously as a businessman. And other countries he ignored totally because they did not represent anything for his own. That's what you call a transactional diplomacy.
That's super transactional. The Muslim ban, all the countries that were on the Muslim ban were countries he had no business dealings with. All the countries that he, that were not on the Muslim ban, coincidentally, were countries he had business dealings with. Now, there's a coincidence.
For the Muslim countries, there is also a political element there. It's not only transactional. There was a political reason also to show that he's fighting terrorism, and it's like migration. So he decreed that people coming from Muslim countries not only might bring the pandemic to the United States, but also can be dangerous because they might belong to terrorist groups. So it has definitely a political aspect, a political element to it also.
Also, in terms of being able to confine China, do you feel that, he got rid of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but one of the major reasons why the Trans-Pacific Partnership was created was as a counterbalance to China, as an economic counterbalance to confine and to deal with China. When he got rid of the TPP, he basically got rid of the apparatus that he needed to have a united front against the Chinese. So when he entered into the trade war with them, it ended up failing because we had to spend billions of dollars to prop up our farms. And he ended up signing an agreement with them, which was basically going right back to ground zero.
The rationale behind that, I think, was Trump preferred to have one-on-one negotiations with the US allies in Asia. And he did sign, actually, as you know, trade agreements separately with Japan, which were very favorable to the United States. With Japan separately, with South Korea separately, with Taiwan separately, and I think even with the Philippines separately. But aside from, I don't know for the other countries, I guess the other countries, he does not believe that they represent such a power in the larger scheme of things. And India, of course, India is a very important piece in the Asian diplomacy for Trump. The administration turned away completely from Pakistan when the administration realized that Pakistan was playing a very troublesome role in Afghanistan, helping the Islamic movement to some extent. So they turned away from Pakistan, which was one of the major allies in Asia of Trump. So Pakistan got closer to China in recent years and turned totally towards India. And as a matter of fact, it seems to me that Modi and Trump and Indian-American relations have improved tremendously over the 4 or 5 past years. Also using India as to counter China's expansion in the region. So yeah, Trump's idea was to have peaceful agreements actually with the major powers in Asia, major allies in Asia, and just leave aside the smaller countries, Malaysia, Singapore, with which the US has very good relations in the first place. So that was the rationale behind it. That he does not to mention that basically he does not believe in multilateral agreements per se. So he feels more comfortable if the United States signs on one-on-one, where the United Nations is in a position of power, signing one-on-one agreements with smaller countries, where it might get an advantage because it's larger and because in the Asian allies, the US protects them. So that's, I believe, the rationale.
I agree, by the way, with you and Alan that my term fascism might be a bit strong. But remember, fascism usually doesn't start immediately as fascism. It drifts into fascism. So for many of these countries, they're drifting in that general direction. That's what I'm concerned about.
But, you know, coming from Europe, fascism is a very strong term in Europe. And it reminds me more, Tom, of Germany, okay, than of Poland today. That's why I'm so hesitant to use the term fascism for, like in this country, this term of fascism has been thrown around very liberally. And I have the feeling that people who talk so easily about fascism don't really understand how far fascism can go. I couldn't not even compare Poland today or Hungary today to Mussolini's Italy. It's illiberal, I agree with you. But to say that they are fascist, the fascist laws go very far. All right. Anything else? Anything else once? Anything else twice? I think we are done for today.